I learned early that silence makes people uncomfortable only if they notice it. In my family, silence was treated like background noise, something you talked over, something you filled with your own opinions. The night my brother laughed and told me, "You don't speak up enough to be taken seriously." I was 29 years old, sitting at my parents' dining table, and I could feel that familiar tightening in my chest. Not embarrassment exactly, more like recognition. Like hearing a line you've already heard rehearsed behind your back finally spoken out loud. Everyone went quiet for half a second, the kind of pause that pretends to be awkward but is really just waiting for permission. Then my dad nodded, slow and thoughtful, like my brother had just made a reasonable observation. My mom didn't even look at me. She just reached for her water and said, "Well, he's not wrong." And that was that. No one asked if I wanted to respond. No one checked my face. They just moved on, confident they'd correctly summarized who I was. I'm Tobias, 29, the older brother by 18 months, though you wouldn't know it by how things played out in our house. Growing up, I was the quiet one. Not shy exactly. I paid attention. I listened. I remembered details. My brother, Mark, filled every room he walked into. Loud opinions, quick jokes, endless confidence, even when he had nothing solid behind it. That confidence was treated like proof of competence. Teachers praised him for leadership. Relatives called him sharp. Meanwhile, I was nice, which in my family was just a polite way of saying invisible. If Mark talked over me, it meant he cared. If I stayed quiet, it meant I didn't have anything worth saying. That narrative followed us into adulthood like an unspoken agreement everyone but me had signed. Family dinners were where it showed the most. Mark would dominate the conversation, telling stories about work that grew more impressive with every retelling. My parents leaned in, asked questions, laughed at the right moments. If I tried to contribute, I was interrupted or redirected. Eventually, I stopped trying. It wasn't sulking. It was efficiency. Why waste energy fighting for space that clearly wasn't meant for me? I answered when asked. I smiled when expected. I stayed quiet. And the quieter I became, the more they used that silence as evidence that they were right about me all along. That night at the table wasn't the first time Mark had taken a jab like that, but it was the first time he'd said it so plainly, like a verdict. We'd been talking about some upcoming paperwork, nothing specific yet, just vague plans my parents were tossing around about consolidating accounts, updating things for the future. Mark had been holding court, explaining how he'd handle it, what he thought made sense. At one point, he gestured toward me with his fork and laughed. "See, this is what I mean," he said. "Tobias never speaks up. You gotta say something if you want to be taken seriously." He looked at me then, smiling like it was friendly advice. Like he was doing me a favor. I remember exactly what I felt in that moment. Not anger. Not even hurt. It was more like a quiet click in my head, the sound of something settling into place. I looked around the table and saw the nods, the agreement, the complete lack of curiosity about my side of things. And I understood something very clearly. They didn't actually want me to speak up. They wanted me to confirm what they already believed. Any response I gave would be filtered through that assumption. If I disagreed, I'd be defensive. If I joked it off, I'd be unserious. If I explained myself, I'd be overcomplicating things. Silence, at least, let me observe. So I stayed quiet. I took a sip of my drink and let the conversation roll on without me. Mark seemed pleased, like my lack of response proved his point. My parents relaxed back into their chairs. The moment passed, filed away as just another harmless family comment. But for me, it stuck. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. That's how they saw me. That's how they treated me. And more importantly, that's how they planned around me. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I'd ignored before. Decisions being discussed in group chats I wasn't included in. Plans being made and then presented to me as already settled. My parents would say things like, "We assumed you'd be fine with it," or "Mark already looked into that." Anytime something required initiative or authority, it went to him by default. If something went wrong, it was brushed off as a learning experience. If I hesitated or asked a question, it was framed as uncertainty, proof that I wasn't decisive enough. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that I'd been handling my own affairs quietly for years. While Mark talked, I worked. While he made plans out loud, I read contracts carefully. I didn't announce things until they were done. That had always been my nature. But in a family that valued volume over substance, that approach made me look passive. And I let them believe it. Not out of fear, out of patience. The first real hint that my silence mattered came months later, subtle enough that they didn't recognize it as a shift. My mom called me one afternoon, casual tone, asking if I had a minute. She mentioned needing to run something by me, some documents that might need reviewing. Nothing urgent, she said, just something they were sorting out. I said sure, told her to send them over when ready. She thanked me and hung up. An hour later, Mark texted me asking if I'd seen the paperwork yet, adding a laughing emoji and a comment about how this stuff always went over my head. I stared at the message for a long time before replying with a simple, "Not yet." What none of them realized was that the documents they were referring to, vaguely, carelessly, touched on things I'd quietly positioned myself around. Things I'd taken responsibility for without ever announcing it. Not because I wanted leverage, but because someone had to be thorough. Someone had to actually read the fine print. I'd never corrected their assumptions because correcting them wouldn't have changed how they operated. But paperwork? Paperwork didn't care who spoke the loudest at dinner. It cared about names, signatures, and authority. At the next family gathering, Mark was louder than ever. He joked about me being the quiet genius, now that I was apparently involved in grown-up stuff. Everyone laughed. I smiled politely and said nothing. My dad clapped Mark on the shoulder and said it was good he was taking charge. My mom nodded, relieved. The dynamic felt settled to them. To me, it felt like standing on the edge of something, watching people walk confidently toward a door they hadn't realized was locked. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, the way rot does behind a clean wall. After that first phone call, the one where my mom asked if I could take a look at some documents, I became something new in the family without ever being formally acknowledged. Not respected, not included, just useful. The tone changed. Instead of being ignored, I was consulted in small, careful doses. Instead of assumptions made openly, they started being made privately, then delivered to me as if they were requests. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so revealing. At first, it was minor things. My dad would ask, almost offhandedly, whether something made sense on paper. My mom would forward me an email and ask if I could skim it real quick. Every time, there was this unspoken expectation that I'd quietly agree, confirm their plan, and step back into my usual place. And every time, I responded calmly, carefully, without pushing back too hard. I didn't want to tip my hand. I wanted to understand how far they'd go assuming I existed only as a background resource. Mark, on the other hand, didn't change his behavior at all. If anything, he leaned into it. He started speaking for me in conversations, summarizing my supposed opinions before I had the chance to express them. Tobias is good with details, he'd say, waving his hand dismissively. But big picture stuff? That's more my thing. Everyone nodded along. It was almost impressive how confidently he rewrote my role right in front of me. And I let him. Not because I agreed, but because every word he spoke revealed how little he actually understood what was happening. The favoritism sharpened as real decisions started coming into play. There was talk of restructuring finances, consolidating assets, simplifying things so nothing gets complicated later. That phrase came up a lot. Nothing gets complicated later. It was always said with a laugh, like the future was some distant, abstract concept instead of something that would one day arrive whether they were ready or not. Mark positioned himself as the natural point person. He talked about efficiency, about streamlining, about how someone needed to take charge. My parents ate it up. They liked the certainty in his voice. They liked not having to think too deeply. Meanwhile, my involvement stayed carefully limited. I wasn't invited to planning meetings. I wasn't included in group chats. I found out about decisions after they'd already been discussed and half implemented. If I raised a question, it was framed as me being anxious. If I suggested an alternative, it was treated as unnecessary complication. Let's not overthink this, my dad would say, the same way he always had. And I'd nod, making a mental note every time they brushed past something important. The breaking point didn't come from one massive blow-up. It came from accumulation, from being spoken over one too many times, from watching Mark take credit for work I'd quietly done behind the scenes, from realizing that my silence, which I'd once used as a shield, was now being used against me as proof that I didn't deserve a say. The night it finally snapped, it was supposed to be another ordinary family dinner. Casual, comfortable, predictable. That's what made it worse. We were halfway through the meal when my mom mentioned, almost cheerfully, that they'd made some progress on finalizing plans. She didn't specify which plans. She didn't need to. Mark immediately jumped in, explaining how they'd decided to move forward with a particular structure, how it would be simpler for everyone involved. He spoke quickly, confidently, like he was presenting a finished project. I listened carefully, heart pounding, because I knew exactly what he was talking about. And I knew exactly what he was getting wrong. When he finished, my dad turned to me with a polite smile. "You're okay with that, right?" he asked. Not because he wanted my opinion, but because he wanted my confirmation. The room went quiet again, just like it had months earlier. I could feel all eyes on me, waiting for the same outcome they were used to. A nod, a shrug, silence. For a moment, I considered it. It would have been easy, comfortable even, but something in me had shifted. Not anger, not rebellion, just clarity. I opened my mouth to speak, and Mark cut me off. "He's fine with it," he said, laughing. "Right, Tobes?" He looked at me, expectant, daring me to contradict him. My mom smiled, relieved. My dad nodded, already moving on. And in that moment, something cracked wide open. Not because they disagreed with me, but because they didn't even think it was necessary to let me speak. I set my fork down carefully. The sound was louder than I expected. Mark glanced at me, annoyed. "What?" he said. I met his eyes and said, calmly, evenly, "Actually, I'm not." The silence that followed was different this time. Heavy, uncomfortable. My dad frowned. My mom's smile faded. Mark scoffed. "See," he said to them. "This is what I mean. He never speaks up until it's inconvenient." That did it. Months of being minimized, dismissed, and rewritten boiled over into something sharp and clear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply asked a question. "When were you planning to tell me?" I said. My mom blinked. "Tell you what?" she asked, genuinely confused. That's when I realized how deep it went. They didn't think they were hiding anything. They thought I was already on board. They thought my silence was consent. The conversation spiraled from there. Mark grew defensive, insisting they were just trying to be practical. My dad talked about trust. My mom talked about family unity. Every concern I raised was reframed as negativity. Every objection was met with reassurance instead of answers. And then, casually, almost as an afterthought, my mom said it. The thing that changed everything. "Well," she said, smoothing her napkin, "since Mark's the one taking responsibility for everything, it just made sense to move forward without waiting on you." Without waiting on you. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. That was it. That was the betrayal. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet confirmation that they had already decided my role without me. That my presence was optional until they needed something specific. I looked around the table, at the people who had watched me shrink for years and mistaken it for weakness. And for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt done. I stood up slowly, chair scraping against the floor. Everyone froze. "I need some air," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. No one stopped me. No one apologized. I walked out of that house knowing something irreversible had happened. They had crossed a line they didn't even know existed. And as I stepped into the night, my phone buzzed in my pocket with a message that would confirm just how far they were willing to go without me. I didn't read the message right away. I stood outside for a long time, staring at nothing in particular, letting the cold air steady my breathing. I already knew it wouldn't be good. Messages like that never were. When I finally pulled my phone out, my hands were calm in a way that surprised me. The screen lit up with Mark's name and a single line beneath it. "We already signed. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." That was the moment I realized how thoroughly I'd been cut out. Not sidelined. Not overlooked. Actively bypassed. Whatever decisions they'd been discussing for months, whatever simplifying they'd been doing, they'd gone ahead and finalized without me. And not because I was unavailable, because they assumed I wouldn't matter. I drove home in silence. No music. No podcasts. Just the hum of the road and the slow, heavy realization settling in my chest. I replayed conversations in my head, little comments I'd brushed off at the time. The way my mom had said, "We didn't want to bother you." The way my dad had talked about trust without ever asking for mine. The way Mark had joked about me being quiet like it was a flaw instead of a choice. It all lined up now, ugly and obvious. They hadn't misunderstood me. They'd rewritten me into something more convenient. The days that followed were some of the quietest of my life. I didn't go to work for a couple of days. I didn't answer texts. I didn't explain myself to anyone. I stayed in my apartment, letting the weight of it all sink in. This wasn't just about paperwork or decisions. It was about identity, about realizing that the people who were supposed to know me best had never really seen me at all. And worse, they were comfortable with that. There were moments when the anger flared hot and sharp. Moments when I imagined storming back into that house, laying everything out, forcing them to listen. But those fantasies faded quickly, replaced by something heavier. Disappointment, grief, a sense of foolishness for believing that patience would eventually be rewarded. That if I just waited long enough, they'd notice the substance behind the silence. Rock bottom isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just waking up and realizing you don't feel anchored to anything anymore. I questioned everything about myself. Had I really been too passive? Had my silence been cowardice instead of restraint? I replayed every moment I'd chosen not to speak, wondering if I'd trained them to ignore me. That line of thinking was dangerous, and I knew it. It took effort to pull myself out of it, to remind myself that being overlooked isn't the same as being at fault. What saved me, oddly enough, was routine. Simple, unglamorous routine. I started going back to work, throwing myself into projects with a focus I hadn't felt in years. I stayed late. I volunteered for things no one else wanted to handle. Not to prove anything to anyone, but because it felt grounding, familiar. Competence was something I could still trust. Results didn't argue with you or talk over you. They just existed. Slowly, I began to take stock of my own life, independent of my family's narrative. My finances were stable. My career was solid. I had responsibilities I'd handled quietly for years without applause. I started seeing a pattern I'd missed before. Every area of my life that thrived did so away from my family's influence. Every place I felt small was tied to them. That realization didn't hurt as much as I expected. It felt clarifying. I stopped reaching out, not as a punishment, but as a boundary. If they wanted access to me, they could ask. If they wanted my input, they could invite it. The silence that followed was telling. Days turned into weeks with minimal contact. When they did reach out, it was vague, neutral, like we were distant relatives instead of immediate family. And for the first time, I didn't rush to fix that. During that period, I started revisiting things I'd put off for years. Plans I'd delayed because they didn't align with family expectations. Opportunities I'd downplayed because they didn't fit the version of me they'd decided on. I updated my professional credentials. I took on consulting work on the side. I invested time in learning things I'd always been interested in but never pursued openly. Each small step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd surrendered without realizing it. The irony was that as I grew more confident, more grounded, my family started noticing. Not directly, of course. That would have required self-reflection. Instead, it came in sideways comments. My mom mentioning she'd heard I was doing well. My dad asking casual questions about my workload. Mark making jokes about me being mysterious now. They sensed the shift, even if they didn't understand it. And that unsettled them. The first real test of my resolve came when my mom called one evening, her voice carefully upbeat. She asked how I was, told me she missed me, said things felt off lately. I listened without interrupting. When she finally paused, clearly waiting for reassurance, I simply said I was taking some space. The silence on the other end was thick. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize either. She just said she understood, in the way people do when they don't actually understand but don't want to push. After that call, something inside me settled. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't desperate to be seen. I was just done chasing approval that had always been conditional. I focused on building a life that felt solid from the inside out. A life where my value wasn't measured by how loudly I spoke at a dinner table. Months passed. The distance between us became normal, comfortable even. And then, slowly, subtly, the tone of their messages began to change. Less confident, more tentative. Questions started replacing statements. Requests replacing assumptions. I noticed it immediately, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet awareness. Something in their world was shifting, and for the first time, they weren't entirely in control of it. One afternoon, my dad called and asked if we could talk. Just talk, he said, about some things coming up. Important things. His voice carried a strain I hadn't heard before. I agreed, not committing to anything beyond the conversation. When I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, feeling that familiar tightening in my chest return, not from fear this time, but from anticipation. Because whatever was coming next, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the same quiet presence they'd dismissed months ago, and they were about to find out just how much they'd underestimated the cost of cutting me out. I agreed to meet my dad a few days later, not at the house, not around a dinner table where old habits could corner the conversation, but at a quiet cafe halfway between our places. Neutral ground. He arrived early, already seated when I walked in, hands folded around a cup he hadn't touched. That alone told me more than anything he could have said. My father never waited. He was a man who liked control, liked momentum. Seeing him still like that felt like noticing a crack in a wall you'd always assumed was solid. We talked carefully at first. Work, weather, nothing that mattered. Then he leaned back and sighed, long and heavy, like he was preparing to lift something awkward. He said things were getting complicated, that certain decisions they'd made earlier were now creating obstacles. He didn't apologize. Not directly. Instead, he framed it as timing, as miscommunication, as things moving faster than expected. I listened, nodding occasionally, letting him fill the space the way Mark always had. It was almost painful how familiar the pattern was. Eventually, he got to the point. They needed clarity. They needed cooperation. There were documents that required confirmation, approvals that couldn't be pushed through without my involvement. He said my name carefully, like he was testing whether it still belonged to me. I didn't respond right away. I took a sip of my coffee and let the silence stretch. Watching him grow uncomfortable in that space was strange. Not satisfying, just instructive. I told him I need to review everything myself. All of it. No summaries. No assumptions. His shoulders stiffened, but he nodded. He said he understood. I knew he didn't, not fully, but he was willing to pretend if it meant moving forward. That was fine by me. When we parted ways, he thanked me for my time. Time. The word lingered with me long after I left. That conversation opened a door I'd suspected existed but hadn't been certain of. Over the next few weeks, information started flowing my way in small, cautious streams. Emails forwarded with minimal commentary. Calls framed as quick questions. Each interaction confirmed the same thing. They'd built a structure that leaned on me more than they'd realized, and now they were feeling the weight of it. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't offer solutions unless asked directly. When I did speak, I was precise, measured, impossible to dismiss without consequence. I also started reaching out beyond my family. Quietly, discreetly. People I'd worked with before. Advisors who knew my attention to detail. Individuals who understood the importance of positioning before action. I didn't frame it as revenge. I framed it as preparation. Understanding my options. Mapping leverage. There's a difference between anger-driven retaliation and strategic response. One burns out quickly, the other waits. What surprised me most during that time was how much support I found once I started speaking to the right people. Colleagues who'd always assumed I preferred working independently admitted they'd never realized how much I carried. Friends I hadn't leaned on before offered perspective without judgment. Every conversation reinforced the same truth. My silence had been mistaken for weakness by those who benefited from it. Others had simply respected it. Meanwhile, Mark grew restless. I could tell by the tone of his messages, the forced humor, the sudden friendliness. He started asking my opinion more often, looping me into conversations he'd once dominated alone. It wasn't humility. It was necessity. He'd lost the ease he once had, the confidence that came from being the unquestioned authority. Watching him struggle to adjust without acknowledging why was almost painful. Almost. The real setup began when my mom called one evening, her voice tight with concern. She asked if I'd noticed delays, if I thought things were moving slower than expected. I told her truthfully that I was still reviewing everything, that I wanted to be thorough. She agreed, too quickly, assured me that was wise. The conversation felt like walking on thin ice, every word chosen carefully to avoid cracking it. When we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about how roles had reversed without a single dramatic confrontation. I started documenting everything, every request, every assumption, every time they spoke about decisions as if they were already made. Not to trap them, but to ground myself. Memory can be slippery, especially when people start rewriting history to suit their needs. I wanted clarity. I wanted a record. And as that record grew, so did my understanding of just how casually they dismissed me when it mattered most. Opportunities began presenting themselves around the same time. Not directly tied to my family, but adjacent enough to matter. Options that gave me flexibility, control, independence. I evaluated them carefully, not rushing, not announcing anything. The more secure my position became, the less pressure I felt to resolve things quickly. Time, once again, was on my side. The final piece of the setup came unexpectedly. A message from Mark, late one night, asking if we could talk. Just the two of us. No parents. No intermediaries. I stared at the screen for a long time before agreeing. We met a few days later, and he tried to joke his way through the tension at first. It didn't work. Eventually, the truth slipped out. He admitted he was overwhelmed, that things weren't as simple as he'd thought, that he might have underestimated how everything fit together. He didn't apologize for what he'd said at that dinner months ago. He didn't acknowledge the betrayal directly. Instead, he asked for help. Straight out. The irony was almost too neat. I told him I'd think about it. And I meant it. Not because I owed him anything, but because every move from here on out needed to be deliberate. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt something settle into place. The anger was gone. The hurt had dulled. What remained was clarity and choice. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was positioning. And soon, very soon, they were going to realize that asking for permission was the easy part. The real cost would come from understanding why they needed it in the first place. When I finally agreed to meet everyone together, it was on my terms. Not at the house where the hierarchy was baked into the furniture, not at a restaurant where politeness could blur accountability. I booked a small conference room at a neutral office building downtown and told them I had everything ready. The phrasing was intentional. It framed the meeting as procedural, not emotional. They arrived tense but hopeful, carrying folders and expectations, still believing this was about smoothing things over and moving forward. They sat across from me, my parents side by side, Mark slightly forward like he always positioned himself, still instinctively trying to lead. I let them settle. I let the silence stretch. Then I slid a single folder across the table. Not dramatically, just enough for them to notice it was thicker than theirs. I started calmly, explaining the timeline. When decisions were first discussed. When assumptions were made. When signatures were gathered without me. I didn't accuse. I referenced dates. Documents. Emails. I watched my dad's face change as he realized I wasn't improvising. This wasn't a reaction. It was a record. My mom's hands tightened around her pen. Mark leaned back, suddenly quiet. Then I explained what they'd overlooked. The structural dependencies they'd ignored. The clauses they hadn't read because they trusted momentum more than detail. I showed them where my name appeared. Not as a courtesy, as a requirement. I explained how their early decisions had locked them into needing my approval to move forward. And then I explained something else, just as calmly. I wasn't withholding permission. I had already exercised it. Over the past months, I'd reorganized my own position. I'd separated myself cleanly from the structure they assumed I'd remain part of. I'd accepted an opportunity that shifted authority away from shared control. Perfectly legal. Perfectly documented. Every step taken with advisors who'd confirmed the same thing. I was entitled to do exactly what I'd done. Their plan depended on my silence continuing. Mine depended on nothing but my signature. My dad asked, quietly, what this meant. I told him it meant they would have to unwind what they'd rushed. That timelines would reset. That leverage they thought they held no longer existed. My mom asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I told her the truth. I had spoken. They just hadn't listened. Mark finally tried to interject, his voice sharper than he probably intended. He said this felt excessive, that we were family, that this wasn't how things were supposed to work. I looked at him and said something I'd rehearsed carefully. You taught me how things worked, I said. You said I didn't speak up enough to be taken seriously. I listened. I just chose a language you couldn't interrupt. The fallout was immediate but contained. There were no raised voices, just the slow collapse of certainty. My parents realized how thoroughly they'd sidelined the one person who could have helped them avoid this outcome. Mark realized that confidence without comprehension was a liability. They asked if there was a way forward. I said there was, but it would be different. Transparent. Documented. Equal. And only if they acknowledged what they'd done. That acknowledgement came awkwardly. Incomplete. But real enough. I didn't need apologies. I needed recognition. When the meeting ended, they left quieter than they'd arrived, carrying the weight of consequences they could no longer delegate. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic shifted permanently. Decisions slowed. Conversations became careful. My input was requested, not assumed. Mark stopped joking about my silence. My parents stopped speaking for me. The structure they'd relied on had changed, and they had no choice but to adapt. As for me, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. I'd proven something to myself that no dinner table debate ever could. That silence isn't weakness. It's restraint. And when you finally choose to speak, the power isn't in volume. It's in timing. The last thing my brother ever said to me about that night months ago was quiet and unguarded. "I didn't realize you were paying attention," he admitted. I looked at him and smiled. "I always was," I said. "You just never noticed."